I was thinking today about the problem of evil. I was thinking back to what I believed about that back when I was a Christian, how I tackled that problem, and also about how I've heard it tackled by other people. Well, the problem of evil is essentially this. You have a God who is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good, right? And yet there is suffering. In particular, there is the suffering of people who serve him. The problem of evil doesn't really amount to much when you just think about your garden variety sufferings. But when you apply it to something drastic, then you can see that this is a problem that has some considerable weight. For instance, there's one particular really horrible example that I heard on the radio once, and it just always stuck in my mind because it was so horrible. So I'm going to use that as an example. You may have heard me quote this one before, if you've been on my channel for a while. So this is something that actually happened to an infant, right? There was an infant whose father took her, filled the bath full of scalding hot water, and dipped the infant's toes in the water, in and out of the water repeatedly, to the point where the toes melted. Okay, so if you imagine, you know what it's like to touch scalding water, right? Imagine what it was like for this infant, and then to be disfigured as a result of that. This is a deeply troubled and perverse man who did this. But according to the Christians and the other monotheists, we live in a universe where there is a personal God, a God who is all-powerful, who controls everything, right? Now, then we have free will, of course, and that's always been a paradox to explain how man can be free and yet God's in charge of everything. So the problem of evil works like this. If we say God is all-powerful, but is unwilling to intervene in a situation like the one I described, how then can he be good? Right? If we say that God doesn't intervene in that situation because he is not able, then we rob him of his all-powerful status, right? So you have a problem, whichever way you look at the problem of evil. There is evil, and it can't seem to be resolved one way or the other. The way I've heard it resolved by most people who tackle it is to say, it's not God who's doing these things, it's man. That evil was perpetrated not by God, but by an evil man. But, they're just sneaking in the fact there that they've decided, for the convenience of this argument, they've decided that God is not in charge of everything that happens. God is not providentially in control of human events. How does a God like that answer prayer? Why would you pray to a God like that if he is impotent? For instance, let's say I came up to a Christian and stuck a knife against his throat, right? And I said, do you think your God can help you now? God's supposed to have a plan for your life, but I've got free will. You see the problem here? You can't really have it both ways. If you want to make me completely responsible for the choice of whether that person lives or dies, then you can't have a God who's in control of everything. And if God is in control of everything, then I can't be responsible for what happened, But ultimately the Bible teaches that God is in control. If he's not in control, you can't have any sort of plan. You can't have prophecies that are fulfilled, because all it takes for someone to thwart a prophecy is someone to have complete free will so that they can thwart anything God does. How is Armageddon supposed to unfold exactly like it says in the book of Revelation if I'm completely free? It's interesting to consider. Is Satan free to say, you know what, Lord, I'm not going to show up at Armageddon? It's funny to kind of think about it that way, And if he's not free, if he has to come and have the battle, how is it his fault, So you get into all this weird and wonderful territory when you think about these concepts. Of course, nowadays, all this is meaningless to me because it's all mythical, right? None of this is true. But yet, people take seriously the idea of God as an anthropomorphic being who watches over us. So these issues have to be tackled, right? So the usual way, as I said, that people tackle it is to just rob God of his power, to say it's all to do with man. But you know that's a cheat. But back when I was a Christian, I had a more sophisticated way of looking at that problem. And it went like this. I recognized that due to the sin of Adam in the Garden of Eden, all mankind stands condemned, right? So the attitude of God to man is, you don't deserve anything. You're under my condemnation. And that applies to every man, woman, and child. You're all born with the sinful nature. You're born into condemnation, right? Sounds pretty cold, but it's actually fairly biblical, right? You must be redeemed. And that's why Christ came on the cross, and you have to choose his salvation. Yeah, you're all familiar with this story. So I understood that any mercy that I got from God was exactly that, mercy, undeserved favor. It's not mercy if you deserve it, right? So you're under his condemnation to start with. So when something bad happens to a Christian or a non-Christian or whatever, I just accepted that as God doing what God does for God's reasons, because we don't actually deserve anything. You see? The ultimate example of something like this is the book of Job in the Old Testament. And Job was subjected to a rigorous test from God, where his family, his sons were killed, his possessions, I think, were stolen. It's been a while since I've read the book of Job. And his health was destroyed. He was all covered in boils. His life was essentially ruined, and yet he maintained his faith in God, even when his friends were saying, "Oh, Job, what did you do? You must have offended God in some terrible way for all of this to happen to you." He was like, "No, I haven't done anything." He stood his ground, but he spoke defiantly to God. He demanded an answer from God, you know? And you think, when you're reading the book, that there's going to be some big magnificent answer at the end of this. What's God going to say to him? And essentially God appears to him in a whirlwind, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he essentially says, "Who the hell are you to question me? You're just a creature. I'm the one who fashioned the world. I'm the one who made the universe. You think you're going to say something to me and you're going to be right? How can you be right? I'm God. You're just a creature." So even though Job had this intellectual problem, God was only willing to solve it by saying, "You need to trust that I'm the one who's right and you're the one who's wrong, even when you don't have an answer." You see? And I saw a strange kind of wisdom in that, and I humbled myself before that, to the point where, you look at life, and life can throw anything at you, no matter how much it communicates this notion that God seems to hate you. It's actually, this is just what God does, and you have to trust that he has a higher purpose behind it all, even when everything in your brain is telling you that this is completely messed up, right? And there's another example of this kind of thing, which is Abraham and Isaac. God said to Abraham, "I want you to sacrifice your son to me. Kill your son." And Abraham would have felt all the natural compassion that a father feels for a child, but he still brought his son up onto the hillside and prepared him for sacrifice. And then at the last moment, when the blade was about to come down, God speaks up and says, "No, stop." And he essentially said again, I'm paraphrasing, "Don't kill him. It's okay. I just wanted to know that you were willing to do it. Right? So, this, if we interpret the meaning of this, the idea is like, you're supposed to serve God even when everything in your rational brain tells you not to. And if you buy into this sort of way of looking at things, it's very hard to ever see a different picture. And I thoroughly bought into all that, cold as it seems. I could look on a little child. I mean, it is so screwed up. Like I can look at that infant I was talking about earlier, who had his feet burned terribly. It must have been excruciating pain. I can look at that and I can say, well, that child was under sin. That child did not deserve anything. And if God chooses to show mercy to the child or chooses to withhold mercy, that is God's prerogative. And I could actually accept that. It's really like super cold theology, but it really was, in my mind, the only way out of the problem of evil. And it's kind of airtight in a way. Cold as it is, it's sort of airtight. It's a solution to the problem of evil if you've got the stomach to accept it, right? But there's just one problem, and I can see it very clearly now. You're being asked to sacrifice your rational capacity, to say, Lord, I will not question you, when everything in me is telling me to question you and reject this. I will not do it. I will humble myself before you. I will cast my rational mind aside. The problem with that is you had to use your rational mind, first of all, to come to an acceptance that God was real, to come to a belief that the Bible could be trusted. William Lane Craig is always talking about how Christianity is a reasonable faith. You had to use reason to embrace it in the first place. And then, if that very same faith is teaching you to sacrifice your reason, that should be a massive red flag that something is really wrong with this. And you bet there is something really wrong with it. Hence, for this and other numerous reasons, I'm no longer a Christian. The sky